The morning sickness came again, as it had for the past 3 weeks, and Clara Jennings barely made it to the basin behind the barn before her stomach emptied itself. She pressed her forehead against the weathered wood, breathing through her mouth, waiting for the world to stop spinning. This was not how things were supposed to be. She had come to Nevada territory 6 months ago with nothing but a worn valise and a letter promising employment. The letter had been from a woman named Margaret Hawkins, who ran a small boarding house in Silver Creek and needed help with cooking and cleaning. Clara had answered the advertisement in a Boston newspaper, desperate to escape the whispers and the pointed fingers that had followed her ever since Thomas Whitmore had ruined her and then married another woman. But Margaret Hawkins had died 2 weeks before Clara arrived, and the boarding house had been sold to pay debts. Clara had stepped off the stagecoach into a dusty town where she knew no one, with $12 to her name and nowhere to go. That was when she had met Silas Cade. He had been standing outside the general store, loading supplies into his wagon. Tall, so impossibly tall that Clara had to crane her neck to look at his face. Broad shoulders that blocked out the sun, hands like dinner plates, scarred and calloused from years of hard work. Dark hair that curled at his collar, and eyes the color of aged whiskey, rimmed with lines that spoke of squinting into too many sunsets. He was not handsome in the traditional sense. His nose had been broken at least once, maybe twice. A scar ran through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline. His jaw was square and stubborn, covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. But there was something about him that had made Clara stop in her tracks. Something steady, something safe. He had seen her standing there, looking lost and afraid, clutching her valise like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. And without a word, he had walked over and asked if she needed help. Clara had explained her situation, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. She had expected pity, or worse, the kind of calculating look that men sometimes got when they encountered a woman alone and vulnerable. Instead, Silas Cade had simply nodded and said, "I need someone to cook and keep house. Ranch is about 8 miles out. Pay is fair, room and board included. Work is hard but honest." She had accepted before her better judgment could talk her out of it. 6 months later, Clara was still at the Cade Ranch. She cooked 3 meals a day for Silas and his 2 ranch hands, Abel and Joaquin. She kept the house clean, mended clothes, tended the small garden behind the kitchen, and helped with whatever needed doing. It was hard work, harder than anything she had ever done in Boston, but it was honest work, and Silas paid her fairly, just as he had promised. He had never touched her, never looked at her with anything but quiet respect, never made her feel like she owed him anything beyond the work she had agreed to do. And somehow, impossibly, Clara had fallen in love with him. She had not meant to. She had sworn to herself after Thomas Whitmore that she would never be foolish enough to trust another man. But Silas was different. Silas was quiet and steady and kind in ways that he probably did not even realize. He always thanked her for meals, even when they were simple fare. He had fixed the squeaky hinge on her bedroom door the same day she mentioned it. When she had come down with a cold last winter, he had brought her tea and made her stay in bed until she was well, handling the cooking himself despite barely being able to boil water. He was a good man, a decent man, the kind of man Clara had stopped believing existed. And now she was carrying his child. It had happened 2 months ago, on a night when a late spring storm had knocked out a section of fence and scattered the cattle across the northern pasture. Silas had been out for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, working himself to exhaustion to round them up before they wandered too far. When he had finally come home, soaked to the bone and shivering, Clara had drawn him a hot bath and made him sit by the fire until the color came back to his face. She did not know who had moved first. Maybe it had been her, reaching out to brush a strand of wet hair from his forehead. Maybe it had been him, catching her hand and holding it against his cheek. All she remembered was the way his eyes had searched her face, asking a question he could not put into words. And she had answered him, with her lips, with her body, with every part of herself that she had been holding back for fear of being hurt again. It had been tender and fierce and overwhelming, and when it was over, Clara had lain in his arms and felt, for the first time in years, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But the next morning, Silas had barely been able to look at her. He had stumbled through an apology, his face red with shame, telling her that he had taken advantage and that he was sorry and that it would never happen again. Before she could say anything, before she could tell him that she had wanted it, that she had wanted him, he had grabbed his hat and walked out the door. And that was how things had been ever since. Polite, distant, careful. He still thanked her for meals. He still fixed things around the house, but he kept a careful distance between them, never standing too close, never letting their hands brush when she passed him a plate. Clara understood. She knew what he was thinking. He thought he had compromised her virtue. He thought he had made her feel obligated, the way so many employers made their female servants feel. He was trying to give her space, trying to make her feel safe. But what he did not know, what she had not found the courage to tell him, was that their one night together had left her with more than memories. Clara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and straightened up, pressing a palm against her still flat stomach. She was running out of time. Another few weeks, a month at most, and the changes to her body would become impossible to hide. The morning sickness would eventually pass, but her belly would grow, and her breasts were already tender, and soon everyone would know. And then what? Would Silas send her away? Would he be angry? Disgusted? Would he think she had done this on purpose, trying to trap him into marriage? The thought made her stomach turn all over again, though this time it had nothing to do with the pregnancy. She loved him. She loved him with a desperation that frightened her. But she would rather leave and never see him again than have him think she was like Thomas Whitmore, using intimacy as a weapon to manipulate and control. The sound of footsteps made her freeze, heavy boots on hard-packed earth coming around the side of the barn. Silas appeared, his hat pulled low against the morning sun, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes narrowing with concern. "Clara, you all right?" She forced a smile, hating how false it felt on her face. "Fine, just needed some fresh air." He did not look convinced. His gaze moved over her face, taking in the pallor of her skin, the sheen of sweat on her forehead. "You've been looking peaked lately. Maybe you should see the doctor in town." "I'm fine," she repeated more firmly this time. "Just a touch of stomach upset. It'll pass." Silas studied her for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes, something that made Clara's heart skip a beat. But then he nodded and looked away. "Breakfast was good," he said. "Abel and Joaquin already headed out to check the south fence. I'll be working in the barn if you need anything." "Thank you." He turned to go, then stopped. His back was to her, his shoulders tense beneath his workshirt. "Clara." "Yes?" A pause, long and heavy and full of things unsaid. "Never mind," he muttered. "It's nothing." She watched him walk into the barn, her heart aching with words she could not bring herself to say. The days that followed were an exercise in quiet torture. Clara went through the motions of her work, cooking and cleaning and tending the garden, but her mind was elsewhere. She caught herself pressing her hand to her stomach a dozen times a day, as if she could somehow feel the tiny life growing inside her. She found excuses to avoid meals, claiming she had already eaten or that she was not hungry, just so she would not have to sit across the table from Silas and lie to his face. He noticed. She could tell by the way his eyes followed her when he thought she was not looking, by the furrow between his brows that seemed to deepen every day, by the questions he asked that were not really questions at all. "You hardly ate anything at dinner. That dress looks loose on you. I haven't heard you singing while you work lately. You always used to sing." Each observation was like a knife to Clara's heart. He cared about her. He was worried about her, and she was repaying his concern with silence and secrets. One evening, about a week after the morning sickness had started, Clara was sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. The sky was a riot of oranges and pinks and purples, so beautiful it almost hurt to look at. She had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the cooling air, and her hands were clasped in her lap, twisting together with nervous energy. The door behind her opened, and Silas stepped out. He stood there for a moment, not saying anything, just looking at the sunset the same way she was. Then he lowered himself onto the porch step beside her, leaving a careful foot of space between them. "Mind some company?" Clara shook her head, not trusting her voice. They sat in silence for a while, watching the colors shift and change as the sun sank lower. It was peaceful, in a way. Comfortable. The kind of silence that did not need to be filled with words. But beneath that peace, Clara's heart was racing. She could feel the weight of her secret pressing against her chest, demanding to be let out. Every breath was a struggle. Every heartbeat was a countdown. "Silas," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah? I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "All right." But now that she had started, Clara found she could not continue. The words stuck in her throat like jagged stones. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I can't." She stood up quickly, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste to get inside. She heard Silas call her name, but she did not stop. She fled to her room and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as the tears finally came. She cried for a long time. For herself, for the baby, for the man sitting alone on the porch who deserved so much better than her cowardice. And when the tears finally stopped, she made a decision. She would leave tomorrow if she could manage it. She would take her savings, catch the stagecoach to Carson City, and disappear before Silas could discover the truth. It would be easier that way, for both of them. But as it turned out, tomorrow never came the way Clara had planned. She woke before dawn to the sound of shouting, male voices raised in alarm, and the thunder of hooves pounding against hard-packed earth. She threw off her covers and ran to the window just in time to see Abel galloping toward the house, his horse lathered with sweat. Clara dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Silas already at the door, pulling on his boots. "What's happening?" she asked. "Rustlers," Silas said grimly, "hit the north pasture during the night, made off with at least 24 head." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. 24 cattle. At current prices, that was nearly $1,000. For a ranch the size of the Cade place, that kind of loss could be devastating. "What are you going to do?" Silas grabbed his rifle from the rack by the door. "Going after them." Abel saw their tracks heading northwest, toward the mountains. "If we move fast, we might be able to catch them before they get too far." Fear clutched at Clara's heart. "Silas, that's dangerous. Rustlers are desperate men. If they realize you're following them, then I'll deal with it." His voice was hard, brooking no argument. But when he looked at her, something in his expression softened. "I'll be careful, I promise." He turned to go, but Clara caught his arm before she could stop herself. He froze, looking down at her hand on his sleeve, then back up at her face. "Please," she whispered, "please come back." Something passed between them in that moment, something raw and honest and terrifying. Silas's jaw tightened, and for a second Clara thought he might say something, might tell her what she so desperately needed to hear. But then Abel called out from outside, urgent and impatient, and the moment shattered. "I'll be back," Silas said quietly. "Wait for me." And then he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving Clara alone with her fear and her secrets, and the tiny life growing inside her. The day passed in a blur of worry. Clara could not eat, could not sit still. She paced the house like a caged animal, jumping at every sound, straining her ears for the thunder of returning hooves. Joaquin had stayed behind to watch over the ranch and keep Clara safe. He was a quiet man in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. He spent most of the day doing chores around the property, but every hour or so he would stop by the house to check on her. "They'll be all right," he told her, his voice gentle. "Silas knows these mountains better than anyone, and he's got Abel with him. Those two have been through worse than a few cattle thieves." Clara tried to take comfort in his words, but the fear would not let go. As evening approached, and there was still no sign of the men, Clara found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the cold supper she had prepared. She was not hungry. The thought of food made her stomach turn. Joaquin had gone out to secure the barn for the night, and Clara was alone with her thoughts. She pressed her palms flat against the table and closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. What if something had happened to him? What if he was hurt or worse? What if she never got the chance to tell him? The sound of hooves cut through her spiraling thoughts like a knife. Clara shot to her feet and ran to the window. In the fading light, she could make out 2 riders approaching the house. Her heart leapt into her throat as she recognized the broad shoulders of the man in front, Silas. She was out the door before she could think, running across the yard toward him. He had barely dismounted before she threw herself into his arms, clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. "You're back!" she gasped. "You're back. You're safe. I was so worried." Silas's arms came around her, strong and steady, holding her tight against his chest. She could feel his heart pounding beneath her cheek, could smell sweat and leather, and the distinctive scent that was uniquely him. "I'm here," he murmured against her hair. "I'm all right. Everything's all right." For a long moment they just stood there, holding each other in the dying light. Clara could feel tears streaming down her face, but she did not care. All that mattered was that he was here. He was safe. He had come back to her. But then reality intruded, and she became aware of Abel standing nearby, pretending to be very interested in his horse's bridle, and Joaquin, who had emerged from the barn and was watching them with a knowing smile. Clara pulled back, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," Silas said. His voice was rough, and when she looked up at him, there was something burning in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Don't ever apologize for that." They recovered 15 of the stolen cattle. The rustlers had split up once they realized they were being pursued, and most of them had gotten away. But Silas and Abel had managed to corner 3 of them in a box canyon and convince them at rifle point to surrender their stolen goods. They had tied the men up and left them for the territorial marshal to collect. It was not a complete victory, but it was better than nothing. That night, after Abel and Joaquin had gone to bed, Clara found Silas sitting alone in the parlor, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He had cleaned up and changed clothes, but there was still dust in his hair and exhaustion etched into every line of his face. She hesitated in the doorway, uncertain. After her display earlier, she was not sure where they stood. The careful distance he had maintained for the past 2 months seemed to have collapsed, but she did not know what had risen in its place. "Can't sleep?" Silas asked without looking up. "No." Clara stepped into the room and settled into the chair across from him. "I keep thinking about what could have happened. If those men had fought back, if there had been more of them. There's always risk in this life." Silas's voice was matter-of-fact, but not unkind. "You learn to live with it, or you don't last long out here." Clara nodded, though the words did little to ease the tight knot of fear in her stomach. She studied his profile in the firelight, tracing the strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose, the faint scar above his eye. He was so strong, so capable, so determined to carry every burden alone, and she was about to add another burden to his shoulders. "Silas," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He finally looked at her, and Clara's heart nearly stopped at the expression on his face. It was open in a way she had never seen before, vulnerable, hopeful. "I know," he said. Clara blinked. "You know?" "Know what?" Silas held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached out and very gently placed his hand over her stomach. "I know," he repeated. "I've known for a while now." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara could not breathe, could not think. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying to form words that would not come. "How?" she finally managed. Silas's lips curved in a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. "You forget. I grew up on a ranch. I've seen enough pregnant mares and cows and women to recognize the signs, the morning sickness, the fatigue, the way you've been avoiding certain foods." He paused. "The way you look at me when you think I'm not watching." Clara felt heat rushing to her face. I wasn't trying to." "I know," Silas said again, and there was something like tenderness in his voice. "I know you weren't trying to hide it from me. I figured you were just trying to find the right time, the right words." He dropped his hand from her stomach and sat back, his expression growing more guarded. "Or maybe you were trying to figure out how to leave." The last words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" "I saw your valise," Silas said quietly. "The one you keep under your bed. You've been packing it, a little bit at a time. Every day." Clara's throat tightened. It was true. She had been preparing to run, slowly, carefully, adding items to her bag whenever she thought no one was watching. A clean dress, her savings, a few small treasures that she could not bear to leave behind. "I wasn't," she started, but the lie died on her lips. She could not lie to him, not about this. "Yes," she admitted. "I was going to leave. I thought it would be easier." Easier for who? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Clara stared at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. "For both of us," she whispered. I didn't want you to feel obligated. I didn't want you to think I was trying to trap you. What happened between us that night, I know you regretted it. I know you thought you took advantage of me. I couldn't bear the thought of you feeling like you had to marry me just because of— Stop! The word was sharp enough to cut through her rambling. Clara looked up, startled, and found Silas leaning toward her, his expression fierce. Is that what you think? He demanded. That I regretted it? Clara's voice was very small. Didn't you? The next morning you could barely look at me. You apologized and then you walked away, and ever since then you've been keeping your distance like I'm something fragile that might break if you get too close. Silas closed his eyes and let out a long breath. When he opened them again, some of the fierceness had faded, replaced by something that looked almost like pain. I'm not good with words, he said slowly. Never have been. And that morning, I woke up and saw you lying there next to me, and you were so beautiful, Clara. So beautiful it hurt to look at you. And I realized what I had done. Clara's heart clenched. What you had done. I took advantage of you. His voice was rough with self-recrimination. You came here looking for honest work, not to warm my bed. I'm your employer. I'm supposed to protect you, not use you for my own selfish needs. That night, I wasn't thinking straight. I was exhausted, and you were there. And I wanted you so badly that I couldn't see past my own desire. He shook his head. I thought you must hate me. I thought the least I could do was give you space, let you decide if you wanted to stay or go without feeling pressured. For a long moment, Clara could not speak. She could only stare at him, trying to process the enormity of what he was saying. You thought I would hate you, she repeated slowly, because of what happened between us. Yes, you thought I didn't want it. A muscle ticked in Silas's jaw. I didn't know what to think. You never said anything. And I was too much of a coward to ask. Clara rose from her chair and crossed the space between them in 3 quick strides. Before Silas could react, she was kneeling in front of him, her hands framing his face, forcing him to look at her. Listen to me, she said fiercely. That night was the best night of my life. I wanted it. I wanted you. I still want you. The only reason I didn't say anything was because I was afraid. Afraid that you didn't feel the same way. Afraid that I was reading too much into your kindness. Afraid that I would ruin the one good thing I've had since I came to this God-forsaken territory. Silas's hands came up to cover hers, his calloused palms warm against her skin. His eyes searched her face, looking for any sign of deception, and she let him look, let him see every truth she had been hiding. You mean that? He said, and it was not quite a question. With everything I am. Something shifted in his expression. Something cracked open like a dam breaking after years of strain. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe, burying his face in her hair. I love you, he said, and the words were rough, like they were being torn out of him by force. I've loved you since the first day you stepped off that stagecoach. I've loved you every single day since. I tried not to. Tried to tell myself it was wrong, that you deserved better than a broken-down rancher with nothing to offer. But I couldn't stop. I can't stop. Clara felt tears streaming down her face for the second time that day. But these were different. These were the kind of tears that came with joy, with relief, with the overwhelming sense of finally coming home. I love you too, she whispered against his chest. I love you so much it terrifies me. Silas pulled back just enough to look at her face. His thumb traced the curve of her cheek, wiping away her tears with a gentleness that made her heart ache. Then marry me, he said, not because of the baby, not because you feel obligated, but because I can't imagine spending another day of my life without you by my side. Clara laughed through her tears. You're proposing to me while I'm kneeling on the floor? The corner of his mouth quirked. I'm not much for fancy gestures. But if you want, I can find a ring, get down on one knee, proper. Yes, Clara said, cutting him off. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, to all of it. Yes. Forever. Silas kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise. And when they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Clara saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Peace. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Silver Creek. It was a simple ceremony, just a handful of townspeople and the ranch hands as witnesses. Clara wore a dress she had made herself from pale blue cotton, with tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem. Silas wore his Sunday best, which was really just his regular clothes with fewer patches. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the look on his face when she walked down the aisle. What mattered was the way his voice caught when he said his vows. What mattered was the way he held her hand, like it was the most precious thing in the world. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the ranch. Joaquin played his guitar, and Abel danced a jig that made everyone laugh. One of the women from town had baked a cake, and someone had brought a bottle of champagne that had probably cost more than Clara used to earn in a month. As the sun began to set, Clara slipped away from the festivities and made her way to the porch. She needed a moment to breathe, to process everything that had happened. Less than a year ago, she had been alone and afraid, fleeing a scandal that had destroyed her reputation. Now she was married to a man who loved her, carrying his child, building a life that she had never dared to dream of. The door opened behind her, and then Silas was there, his arms sliding around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "You all right?" he murmured against her ear. "More than all right," Clara said. "I was just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never have this. A home, a family, someone who loves me." Silas's arms tightened around her. "You have all of that now, and you always will, as long as I have breath in my body." Clara turned in his embrace so she could look at him. The last rays of sunlight painted gold across his features, softening the hard lines and sharp edges until he looked almost young, almost hopeful. "I still can't believe you knew," she said. "About the baby, all this time, and you never said anything." Silas shrugged, but there was a hint of a smile playing around his lips. "I was waiting for you to be ready. Figured you'd tell me when you wanted to. And if I hadn't, if I had just left," the smile faded, "then I would have come after you, tracked you down, wherever you went, told you that I didn't care about my pride or my fears or anything else except you." His hand came to rest on her stomach, gentle and protective. "Both of you." Clara felt her eyes stinging again. She blamed the pregnancy hormones, but she knew it was more than that. It was the overwhelming realization that she was loved, truly, completely, unconditionally loved. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I've never had a baby before. I don't know if I'll be a good mother. What if I do something wrong? What if—" "Hey!" Silas cupped her face in his hands, tilting it up so she had to meet his eyes. "You're going to be an amazing mother. I've seen the way you care for everyone around you, the way you fuss over Abel when he's sick, the way you listen to Joaquin's stories like they're the most interesting things you've ever heard. Our child is going to be the luckiest kid in the whole territory." "Our child," Clara repeated, testing the words. They felt strange on her tongue. Strange, but wonderful. "I like the sound of that." "Get used to it," Silas said, "because I plan to have a whole house full of them." Clara laughed. "A whole house full? Slow down, Cowboy. Let's get through the first one before we start planning an army." "Fair enough." He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "But just so you know, I'm going to want at least 3, maybe 4. 4? I always wanted a big family," he admitted. "Never thought I'd have one. But now that I do—" He trailed off, his eyes going distant for a moment. "My parents had 6 kids. I was the youngest. Watched all my brothers and sisters grow up, get married, move away. By the time I was 20, I was the only one left. And then the fever took my folks, and I was alone." Clara's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "It was a long time ago," Silas said. "But I always told myself that if I ever had a family of my own, I'd do everything in my power to keep it together, to make sure no one ever felt alone." Clara reached up and touched his face, tracing the scar above his eye with her fingertip. "You won't be alone anymore. Neither will I. We'll have each other, and our baby, and whoever else comes along." Silas caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "That's all I've ever wanted." The months that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. As her belly grew, so did her confidence. She learned to accept that she was loved, that she belonged, that this was her home now and forever. Silas was attentive to the point of being overbearing, which would have annoyed Clara if she hadn't found it so endearing. He worried about her constantly. He made her rest when she was tired, even if she insisted she was fine. He rubbed her aching feet at the end of long days and held her hair back when the morning sickness returned with a vengeance in her second trimester. And every night he lay beside her in bed, his hand resting on her stomach, talking to the baby in a low, soft voice that made Clara's heart melt. He told The baby stories. Stories about the ranch, about the mountains, about the wild horses that roamed the high meadows in summer. He told the baby about his own childhood, about the mischief he and his brothers had gotten into, about the lessons his father had taught him. He told the baby about Clara, about how brave she was, how beautiful, how she had come into his life like a miracle and changed everything. "Your mother is the strongest person I've ever met," Clara heard him say one night when he thought she was asleep. "She crossed a whole country by herself, came to a place where she didn't know a soul, and built a whole new life from nothing. If you're even half as strong as her, you'll be able to do anything you set your mind to." Clara pretended not to hear, but she smiled into her pillow, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. The baby came on a cold November night, when the first snow of the season was just starting to fall. Clara had been having pains all day, but she had dismissed them as false labor, the same as the pains she had been having on and off for the past few weeks. It wasn't until her water broke, right in the middle of dinner, that she realized this was the real thing. What followed was a blur of fear and pain and exhaustion. Silas sent Abel racing into town to fetch the midwife. But the snow was coming down hard now, and Clara knew it would be hours before anyone could get through. "You might have to deliver this baby yourself," she told Silas, panting through a contraction. The color drained from his face. "I don't know how. I've only ever delivered calves and foals. Then you know more than I do," Clara said. She reached for his hand and squeezed it hard. "I trust you. We can do this together." Silas swallowed hard, but he nodded. "All right. Tell me what you need." In the end, the midwife arrived just in time. She was a sturdy woman named Margaret, with capable hands and a no-nonsense attitude. She took one look at the situation, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. 3 hours later, Clara held her daughter for the first time. She was tiny, so tiny and perfect and absolutely beautiful, with a head full of dark hair and a scrunched-up face that reminded Clara impossibly of Silas when he was annoyed about something. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've been waiting so long to meet you." Silas was sitting beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in her arms. He had not said a word since the baby was born, had not made a sound. Clara glanced at him and saw that his face was wet with tears. "Silas," she said softly. He blinked like he was coming out of a trance and looked at her. "She's perfect," he said, his voice hoarse. "She's so perfect, Clara. I didn't know. I couldn't have imagined. Do you want to hold her?" Silas looked terrified at the prospect, but he nodded. Clara carefully transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support her head, how to cradle her against his chest. His hands were shaking, but he held her like she was made of glass, like the slightest wrong move might shatter her. "Hey there, little one," he murmured. "I'm your pa. I know I probably look scary right now, but I promise I'm going to take care of you. You and your mama both. Forever and always." The baby opened her eyes, and Clara saw that they were the same honey brown as Silas's. She made a small sound, not quite a cry, and her tiny hand reached up to grip his finger. Silas made a choked sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "She's got a strong grip," he said. "Going to be a tough one. Just like her mother." "What should we name her?" Clara asked. Silas thought for a moment. "My mother's name was Rose. I always thought if I ever had a daughter I might name her that. But if you don't like it, we can—" "Rose," Clara said, testing the name. It felt right. Felt like it had always been waiting for this moment. This tiny person who would carry it forward into the future. "Rose Cade. I love it." "Rose it is then." Silas leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to the baby's forehead. "Welcome to the family, Rose." The first few weeks were exhausting. Rose was a good baby, but she still needed to be fed and changed and held at all hours of the day and night. Clara felt like she was sleepwalking through life, running on instinct and determination. But Silas was there every step of the way. He got up with her for the late-night feedings, even though there was nothing he could do but keep her company. He took over as many of the household chores as he could manage while still running the ranch. He changed diapers without complaint and learned to sing lullabies in his deep, rumbling voice. And when Clara broke down crying one morning, overwhelmed by exhaustion and hormones and the terrifying responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive, he held her and told her she was doing an amazing job and that he had never loved her more. Slowly, gradually, they found their rhythm. Rose grew bigger and stronger by the day, her dark hair softening to a warm brown, her eyes staying that distinctive honey color that was so clearly her father's. She learned to smile, then to laugh, then to grab for things with her chubby little hands. And Clara learned what it meant to be a mother, to love someone so fiercely that it felt like her heart was living outside her body, to be terrified and joyful and exhausted and grateful all at once. One evening, when Rose was about 3 months old, Clara was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, the baby dozing at her breast. Silas was across the room, reading by lamplight, but Clara could feel his eyes on her. "What is it?" she asked, smiling. Silas set down his book and crossed to where she was sitting. He knelt beside the chair, looking up at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I never thanked you," he said. Clara blinked. "Thanked me? For what?" "For staying." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch impossibly gentle. "When you first came here, I told myself not to hope. Told myself that someone like you would never want to stay with someone like me. But you did. You chose me. You gave me this." His gaze dropped to Rose, sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms. "A family, a home that feels like more than just a house, a reason to wake up every morning looking forward to the day." Clara's eyes were stinging again. She really needed to stop crying so much. "You gave me the same things," she said. "When I came here, I was broken. I thought I would never trust anyone again. Never love anyone again. You showed me that I was wrong. You showed me what it feels like to be safe, to be valued, to be loved." Silas leaned forward and kissed her, soft and slow, mindful of the sleeping baby between them. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the warm air. "I love you," he said. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes. The thought of losing you, either of you." He shook his head. "I don't know what I'd do." "You're not going to lose us," Clara said firmly. "We're not going anywhere. This is our home, this is our family, and nothing is going to change that." Silas smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. Promise? Promise. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the hard-packed earth. Clara stood on the porch, Rose balanced on her hip, and watched Silas working in the corral with one of the yearling horses. He was patient with the animal, gentle even when it tried to buck him off, and Clara marveled at how the same hands that could break a wild stallion could also cradle their daughter with such tenderness. She had written to her sister in Boston a few months ago, telling her everything. About Silas, about the baby, about the life she was building in this wild, beautiful place. She had expected judgment, expected condemnation, expected to be cut off entirely. Instead, she had received a letter filled with joy and congratulations, along with a promise to visit as soon as the weather permitted. It seemed that she was not the only one capable of growth and change. "Mama," Rose burbled, reaching toward the horses with her chubby hands. She was starting to make sounds now, babbling constantly, and Clara was convinced that her first real word would be any day. "Yes, baby girl, that's Papa. He's working with the horse. Can you say horse?" "Bah," Rose said definitively. "Close enough." Silas finished up with the yearling and walked toward the house, dusting off his hands on his trousers. He was smiling, that rare, full smile that Clara loved so much, the one that transformed his stern face into something almost boyish. "She trying to talk again?" he asked, climbing the porch steps. "She's getting there. I think her first word is going to be bah." Silas laughed and leaned in to kiss Clara, then Rose's forehead. The baby squealed with delight and grabbed a fistful of his hair. "Ow! Strong grip." He carefully extracted himself and took Rose from Clara's arms, settling her against his shoulder. "What do you say, little one? Ready for lunch?" "Bah!" Rose agreed. They went inside together, the three of them, and Clara paused in the doorway to look back at the land that had become her home. The rolling hills, the distant mountains, the endless sky that seemed to stretch on forever. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, frightened, ashamed, convinced that her life was over. She had been wrong about so many things, but she had been right about one thing at least. Coming here, taking a chance on this place, and this man, had been the best decision she had ever made. And as she closed the door behind her, stepping into the warm kitchen where her husband was making faces at their daughter, Clara knew that this was just the beginning. The years passed, as years do, bringing changes both expected and unexpected. The ranch prospered. Silas expanded the herd, bought additional land, hired more hands to help with the growing operation. Clara's garden grew from a small patch behind the kitchen to a full acre of vegetables and herbs that she sold at the market in town. Rose grew too, from a babbling infant to a curious toddler, to a spirited young girl who followed her father around like a shadow, asking endless questions about horses and cattle and the wild creatures that lived in the mountains. And Clara's belly grew as well, twice more over the following years. First came William, a solemn-eyed boy with his mother's fair colouring and his father's quiet strength. Then came little Margaret, named for the midwife who had delivered Rose, a wisp of a girl with copper curls and a laugh that could light up any room. 3 children, a whole houseful, just like Silas had wanted. Clara sometimes found it hard to believe that this was her life, that she, who had once been so alone, so afraid, was now surrounded by people who loved her. That she, who had once thought herself ruined and worthless, was now the heart of a thriving family. But every time she doubted, every time the old fears crept back, she would look at Silas and remember the way he had looked at her that night by the fire, when he had placed his hand on her stomach and told her he already knew about the baby. Remember the way his voice had cracked when he asked her to marry him. Remember the countless moments since then, the small kindnesses and quiet affections that added up to something larger than either of them could have built alone. He had known about the baby before she found the courage to tell him. He had known about her plans to leave before she had even finished making them. He saw her, all of her, the good and the bad and the scared, and he loved her anyway. That was what amazed her most, not the love itself, though that was extraordinary enough, but the seeing, the knowing, the way Silas understood her in a way no one else ever had. It was a gift, the greatest gift she had ever received. One evening, when Rose was 7 and William was 4 and Margaret was just learning to walk, Clara found Silas sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. She settled beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder, and for a while they just sat there in comfortable silence. "What are you thinking about?" Clara finally asked. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was thinking about that day you got off the stagecoach. You looked so lost, so scared. I didn't know anything about you except that you needed help, and I wanted to be the one to give it." Clara smiled. "And now look at us. 7 years later, 3 children, more cattle than we know what to do with, and a wife who still makes my heart race every time she walks into a room." Clara laughed, swatting his arm. "Flatterer. It's not flattery if it's true." Silas turned to face her, and his expression was serious now, intent. "I mean it, Clara. Every day I wake up and I look at you, and I can't believe you're real. Can't believe you chose me." Clara reached up and cupped his face in her hands, the same way she had done all those years ago, kneeling in front of him by the fire. "I will choose you every day for the rest of my life," she said, "no matter what happens, no matter what challenges we face. You're my home, Silas Cade. You always will be." Silas leaned down and kissed her, soft and slow, with all the tenderness of their first kiss, and all the passion of the thousands that had followed. And when they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, Clara saw that same peace in his eyes that she had seen on their wedding day. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." From inside the house they could hear the children. Rose was reading a story to William, her voice rising and falling dramatically with the action. Margaret was banging on a pot with a wooden spoon, delighted by the sound it made. It was chaos and noise and beautiful, beautiful life. Clara smiled and nestled closer to her husband, watching as the sun dipped below the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. She had been scared to tell him about the baby, so scared that she had almost run away. Instead, he had already known. He had been waiting. and together they had created something beautiful, a life, a family, a love that would echo through the generations. This was their story, and it was far from over. The autumn of their 8th year together brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough, while Margaret played at her feet. When she heard the sound of an approaching wagon, she wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. The wagon was unfamiliar, driven by a man she didn't recognize, but there was something about the woman sitting beside him that made Clara's heart stop. The woman was thin and pale, with dark hair streaked with grey, and eyes that Clara would have known anywhere, eyes the same shade of blue as her own. "Mother," Clara whispered. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and the woman climbed down, her movements stiff and uncertain. She was older than Clara remembered, frailer, but it was unmistakably Eleanor Jennings, the woman who had turned her back on her own daughter 8 years ago. Clara, her mother's voice, was thin and reedy. "I know I have no right to be here. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to see you. I had to try." Clara stood frozen on the porch, 1,000 emotions warring in her chest. Anger, hurt, a desperate, aching hope that she had thought long buried. "Why?" she finally managed. "Why now? After all this time?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was a fool. Because I let fear and pride destroy the most precious thing in my life. Because I spent 8 years telling myself I had done the right thing. And then one day I woke up and realized I had lost my daughter, and I would never get her back unless I found the courage to try." Clara felt tears streaming down her own face. She wanted to scream, wanted to rage, wanted to slam the door and pretend this wasn't happening. But then she felt a hand on her shoulder, warm and steady, and Silas's voice in her ear. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." She didn't know when he had come up behind her. She didn't care. All that mattered was that he was there, solid and real, reminding her that she was not alone. Clara took a deep breath and stepped down from the porch. She crossed the yard to where her mother stood, trembling like a leaf in the wind, and stopped just a few feet away. "You broke my heart," Clara said quietly. "When you turned me away, when you chose your reputation over your own child, I thought I would never recover from that." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was so terribly, terribly wrong." Clara looked at her mother, really looked at her, seeing the lines of age and grief etched into her face, the desperate hope in her eyes, the way her hands shook as she clutched them together, and she made a choice. "I have children now," Clara said. 3 of them. They've never met their grandmother." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Children? You have... Would you like to meet them?" The sound that came from Eleanor's throat was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Yes. Oh, Clara, yes. More than anything." Clara held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, her mother took it. It would not be easy. There were years of hurt to work through, wounds that would take time to heal. But Clara had learned something over the past 8 years. She had learned that families were not always the ones you were born into. Sometimes they were the ones you chose, the ones you built piece by piece, out of love and forgiveness and the determination to keep trying. She led her mother up to the house, where Silas stood waiting with Margaret in his arms. Inside, Rose and William were peering out the window, curious about the stranger who had arrived. "Children," Clara called, "come meet your grandmother." Eleanor stayed for 3 weeks. She slept in the spare room, helped Clara with the cooking and the children, and slowly, carefully began to rebuild the bridge she had burned so many years ago. It was not perfect. There were difficult conversations. There were moments when old hurts surfaced and had to be worked through. There were tears and apologies and long silences that stretched into the night. But there was also laughter. There were stories shared around the dinner table, memories of Clara's childhood that she had almost forgotten. There were quiet moments when Eleanor sat with Rose and taught her embroidery, or read stories to William and Margaret until they fell asleep in her lap. And there was the look on Eleanor's face the first time Margaret called her Grammy, a look of such pure, overwhelming joy that Clara felt her own heart crack open just a little more. On Eleanor's last night at the ranch, Clara found her sitting alone on the porch, looking up at the stars. Clara settled beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. "I can't thank you enough," Eleanor finally said, "for giving me another chance, for letting me be part of your family." "You're my mother," Clara said simply. "No matter what happened between us, that never changed." Eleanor reached over and took Clara's hand. "You've built something beautiful here, a life, a family. I'm so proud of you, Clara, more proud than I can say." Clara squeezed her mother's hand. "Will you come back to visit if you'll have me?" "Always," Clara said. "This is your home too now, for as long as you want it." Eleanor's eyes glistened in the starlight. "I don't deserve you." "Maybe not," Clara agreed, but she was smiling. "But you're stuck with me anyway." They sat together until the stars wheeled overhead and the night grew cold. Two women who had lost each other and found their way back. Two women who had learned the hard way that love was not about deserving. It was about choosing. Every day, in every moment, choosing to stay. And Clara had made her choice. She would always choose family. She would always choose love. She would always choose home. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and milestones. Rose grew into a capable young woman who could ride as well as any of the ranch hands and had her father's quiet strength. William became a thoughtful, studious boy who preferred books to horses, but worked alongside Silas without complaint. Margaret remained a whirlwind of energy and laughter, brightening every room she entered. And through it all, Clara and Silas stood together, partners, parents, lovers, friends. They weathered droughts and blizzards. They celebrated good harvests and mourned bad ones. They buried Joaquin when the old man's heart finally gave out, and they hired new hands to replace him. They watched their children grow and change and become their own people, and every night, without fail, they lay beside each other in the bed they had shared for over a decade, talking about their days and their dreams and the small, precious moments that made up a life. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one night, her head pillowed on Silas's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Regret what?" "Any of it. Hiring me that day. Taking a chance on someone you didn't know. Everything that came after." Silas was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking slowly through her hair. "Not for a single second," he finally said. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Clara. You and the children. Everything else, good or bad, was worth it to have you." Clara smiled into the darkness. "I love you. I love you too. Always have. Always will." She fell asleep in his arms, warm and safe and utterly content. And somewhere outside, the wind blew across the Nevada hills, carrying the scent of sage and juniper and the promise of another day, another chance, another moment in a life that had turned out to be so much more than Clara Jennings Cade had ever dared to dream. She had come here scared and alone, carrying a secret she was afraid to tell. She had found a man who already knew, who had been waiting for her to say it, who had loved her through her fear and her doubt and her moments of weakness. And together they had built something beautiful, a family, a home, a love story for the ages. The end was not really an end at all. It was just the place where one chapter closed and another began. And Clara knew, with every fiber of her being, that there were still countless chapters to come. She could not wait to live every single one of them, with Silas by her side, forever. On a warm spring evening, nearly 15 years after Clara had first arrived in Silver Creek, she stood in the kitchen of the ranch house preparing for a celebration. Rose was getting married. The young man was named Daniel Reed, a schoolteacher from Carson City who had come to Silver Creek to start a new school. He was kind and intelligent and looked at Rose the same way Silas had looked at Clara all those years ago, like she was the most precious thing in the entire world. Clara approved. The house was bustling with activity. William was helping his father set up tables in the yard. Margaret was supposed to be arranging flowers, but she kept getting distracted by the butterflies in the garden. Eleanor, who had moved to Silver Creek 3 years ago to be closer to her grandchildren, was helping Clara with the food. "You're crying again," Eleanor observed, handing Clara a handkerchief. Clara dabbed at her eyes. "I can't help it. My baby is getting married. She's not a baby anymore. She'll always be my baby." Clara looked out the window at Rose, who was standing in the yard with Daniel, their heads bent close together, whispering and laughing. "But I'm happy for her. He's a good man. He'll take care of her, just like Silas took care of you." Clara smiled. Yes, just like that. The wedding was beautiful, simple and heartfelt, just like the wedding Clara and Silas had had all those years ago. Rose wore a dress that Clara had made for her, pale pink with lace at the collar and cuffs. Daniel wore a suit that was slightly too big for him, borrowed from Silas, and couldn't stop smiling. When the vows were spoken and the kiss was shared, Clara found herself leaning against Silas, his arm around her shoulders, tears streaming down her face. "You all right?" he murmured. "More than all right," she said, echoing words she had spoken to him so many times before. "I'm just happy, so incredibly happy." Silas pressed a kiss to her temple. "Me too." The celebration lasted well into the night. There was food and music and dancing under the stars. Rose and Daniel danced their first dance as husband and wife. William danced with Margaret, making her laugh by stepping on her toes on purpose. Silas pulled Clara into his arms and spun her around the makeshift dance floor until she was breathless and giggling. And when the last guests had gone home and the newlyweds had retired to their room, Clara and Silas stood alone on the porch, looking up at the vast Nevada sky. "We did good," Silas said quietly. "We did," Clara agreed. "We really did." He turned to her, and in the moonlight, he looked almost exactly the same as he had that first day, standing outside the general store in Silver Creek. A little grayer, perhaps, a few more lines around his eyes, but the same steady presence, the same kind heart. "I meant what I said all those years ago," Silas told her. "When I asked you to marry me, I said it wasn't because of the baby, and it wasn't because I felt obligated. It was because I couldn't imagine spending another day of my life without you." Clara smiled. "I remember. I still feel that way," he continued. "Every single day. I wake up and I see you, and I think to myself, how did I get so lucky? How did I end up with this woman who is so much better than I deserve?" Clara reached up and cupped his face in her hands, the same way she had done all those years ago, kneeling in front of him by the fire. "You deserve everything," she said fiercely. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, Silas Cade. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." He kissed her then, deep and slow, with all the passion of two people who had loved each other through every trial and triumph. And when they finally pulled apart, they stood together in the moonlight, hand in hand, hearts full. Their daughter was married. Their son was growing into a fine young man. Their youngest was still wild and free and full of potential. Their family was expanding, changing, becoming something new. But some things never changed. The love between them, the trust they had built, the home they had made together. Those things would last forever. Clara leaned her head against Silas's shoulder and closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of sage and juniper and the man she loved. She'd been scared to tell him about the baby, so scared that she had almost run away. But he had already known. He had been waiting. And together they had created something beautiful, a life, a family, a love that would echo through the generations. This was their story, and it was far from over. 2 years after Rose's wedding, Clara found herself once again standing on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun rise over the Nevada mountains. But this time, she was not alone in her vigil. Rose was inside, laboring to bring her first child into the world, and Clara's heart was full of memories and prayers and the fierce, protective love that only a mother could understand. Silas came to stand beside her, pressing a cup of hot coffee into her hands. His hair was almost entirely grey now, and there were more lines around his eyes than there used to be. But when he looked at her, Clara saw the same man who had offered her a job all those years ago. The same man who had loved her through everything. "She's going to be fine," Silas said quietly. "She's strong, takes after her mother." Clara managed a weak smile. "I know. It's just hard. Waiting, not being able to do anything. That never changes." Silas put his arm around her shoulders. "No matter how old they get, they're still your children. You never stop worrying." Clara leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid warmth. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from the wisest woman I know." Before Clara could respond, the door opened behind them, and Daniel appeared. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking, but he was smiling so wide it looked like it might split his face in two. "It's a boy," he said, his voice cracking. "We have a son, Rose is asking for you." Clara was through the door before Daniel had finished speaking. She raced up the stairs to the bedroom where Rose lay, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "Mama," Rose said, tears streaming down her face. "Come meet your grandson." Clara approached the bed on trembling legs. She looked down at the baby, so small and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and a tiny rosebud mouth, and felt her heart crack open all over again. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "Oh, Rose, he's absolutely beautiful. We're going to name him Silas," Rose said, "after Papa, if that's all right." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She looked over her shoulder at Silas, who had followed her up the stairs and was standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of shock and overwhelming emotion. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked him. "They're naming him after you." Silas crossed the room in 3 long strides. He stood beside the bed, looking down at his daughter and grandson, and Clara saw his jaw working as he struggled to contain his emotions. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed, his voice rough. "I'm honored. He shook his head, words failing him. Rose reached up and took her father's hand. "You're the best man I've ever known, Papa. The best father anyone could ask for. I want my son to grow up to be like you." Silas bent down and pressed a kiss to Rose's forehead, then to the baby's. When he straightened, his face was wet with tears. "I love you," he said, "both of you, all of you, more than I have words to say." And Clara, standing in that room surrounded by 3 generations of the family she had built, felt her heart overflow with gratitude for the scared young woman who had gotten off a stagecoach in a dusty town all those years ago, for the quiet rancher who had seen something in her worth saving, for the love that had grown between them, steady and sure, through every triumph and every trial. Life, she had learned, was not about avoiding pain. It was about finding people worth sharing the pain with, people who would stand beside you through the hard times and celebrate with you through the good, people who saw the truth of who you were and loved you anyway. She had found that in Silas. She had built that with her children, and now, watching her daughter hold her own child for the first time, she saw the legacy of that love stretching forward into the future. This was what mattered. This was what lasted. Not the struggles or the fears or the moments of doubt, but the love that persisted through it all. Clara reached for Silas's hand and squeezed it tight. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked at her, eyebrows raised. "For what?" "For everything. For that day at the general store. For giving me a chance when I had nothing. For loving me when I couldn't love myself. For building this life with me." She gestured at the room around them. "For all of this." Silas raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You never need to thank me for loving you, Clara. It's the easiest thing I've ever done." They stood there together, hand in hand, watching Rose and Daniel marvel over their newborn son, and Clara thought about all the roads that had led to this moment, all the choices, all the chances, all the times when everything could have gone differently. She had been scared to tell Silas about the baby, so scared that she had almost thrown away the best thing that had ever happened to her. But he had already known. He had been waiting, and he had loved her anyway. That was the thing about love, Clara realized. Real love. The kind that lasted. It didn't demand perfection. It didn't require you to have all the answers or always make the right choice. It just asked you to show up day after day and keep trying, keep choosing each other, keep building something together, one small moment at a time. She and Silas had done that. For nearly 2 decades they had done that. And they would keep doing it for as many years as they had left, because that was what love was. Not a feeling, not a promise, but a choice. And Clara would choose Silas Cade every single day from now until forever. The baby stirred in Rose's arms, letting out a small mewling cry. Rose looked up at her mother with wide eyes. "What do I do?" she asked, a hint of panic in her voice. Clara smiled, remembering all too well what it felt like to hold your first child and have no idea what you were doing. "You'll figure it out," she said. "You're going to make mistakes. You're going to doubt yourself. There will be nights when you're so exhausted you can barely see straight, and days when you wonder if you're doing anything right." She reached out and touched her daughter's cheek. "But you'll also discover a love you never knew you were capable of. A love that makes everything else pale in comparison. And when you look at that little boy and see the person he's becoming, you'll know that every hard moment was worth it." Rose nodded, her eyes glistening. "Were you scared when you had me?" "Terrified," Clara admitted. "I had never been more scared in my life, but your father was there. He held my hand and told me everything was going to be all right, and it was." She looked over at Silas, who was watching the exchange with soft eyes. "That's what family is," Clara continued. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being there, showing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Rose smiled down at her son, then back up at her mother. "I hope I can be half the mother you've been." "You'll be better," Clara said with certainty. "You already are." Boom! As the morning sun rose higher over the Nevada mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and rose, Clara Cade stood surrounded by the people she loved most in the world: her husband, her daughter, her newborn grandson. William and Margaret would arrive later that day, eager to meet their nephew. Eleanor had passed peacefully in her sleep the previous winter, but Clara knew her mother was there in spirit, watching over them all. Their relationship had healed completely in those final years, and Clara was grateful beyond words for the chance they had been given to find their way back to each other. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the fear, the heartbreak, the moment she had almost given up on everything, and she thought about Silas, patient, steady, loving Silas, who had seen her when she couldn't see herself, who had waited for her to find her courage, who had loved her before she believed she was worthy of being loved. He had known about the baby before she could bring herself to tell him. He had been waiting for her to say it, and he had loved her anyway, through everything, always. Clara reached for his hand again, and he took it without question, his fingers intertwining with hers in the way they had done countless times before. "I love you," she said, because even after all these years, those words never got old, never lost their meaning, never failed to make her heart skip a beat. "I love you too," Silas replied, "forever." And as they stood there together, watching the beginning of a new generation, Clara knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Home, with her family, with the man who had changed her life forever and always. The end.